In 1933, Adolf Hitler took control of a nation that was functionally dead. It was bankrupt, disarmed, and choking on the modern equivalent of $400 billion in war reparations. 6 million of its people were unemployed, starving, and abandoned by the state. The Treaty of Versailles had banned it from owning tanks, fielding an air force, or maintaining an army larger than 100,000 men. Any one of its European neighbors, France, Britain, Poland, Czechoslovakia, could have crushed it with a single division, a single volley of gunfire. 6 years later, it commanded the most feared military machine on the planet. It had annexed 2 neighboring nations without firing a shot, shattered every rule of the global order, and pushed the world's greatest superpowers to their knees. By September 1939, it would ignite the deadliest war in human history. This is how a broken, dying nation built a war machine that would burn Europe to the ground. To understand how this happened, you first have to grasp just how unsalvageable Weimar Germany looked in 1933. This was not a turnaround project, it was a liquidation sale waiting to happen. The balance sheet was catastrophic. The Treaty of Versailles was less a peace deal than a lifetime non-compete agreement designed to kneecap Germany out of existence. Militarily, it was stripped bare, no conscription, no heavy artillery, no submarines, a token surface navy, and a permanent demilitarized zone in the Rhineland, its own border territory with France. Financially, the 132 billion gold marks in reparations had already collapsed its currency once in the 1923 hyperinflation crisis that incinerated life savings overnight, turning a loaf of bread into a 200 billion mark purchase. Then the Great Depression hit. American loans that had kept the economy on life support vanished. Factories shuttered by the thousands. Unemployment hit 30% of the workforce. For men under 30, it topped 50%. The Weimar Republic itself was a political house of cards. 20 chancellors in 14 years, weak coalition governments that could agree on nothing, and a public that had completely lost faith in democracy. They didn't care about constitutions or republican values. They just wanted someone to fix the mess. The man who stepped into that void had a resume that would have gotten him laughed out of any job interview. Before 30, Adolf Hitler was a destitute, failed art student, twice rejected from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, surviving on cheap postcard paintings and soup kitchen meals in Vienna's homeless shelters. He served 4 years on the Western Front in World War I, earned 2 Iron Crosses for bravery, but never rose above the rank of corporal. His superior officers deemed him too much of a lone wolf to lead men. To the aristocratic Prussian generals and Berlin elite, he was a vulgar, uneducated Austrian rabble-rouser. But those years in Vienna's gutters and the trenches gave him a superpower no sheltered elite could ever learn. He knew exactly what the forgotten, angry, desperate people of Germany really wanted. Not what politicians said they should want, what they ached for in the dark. His first grab for power was a catastrophic failure. In 1923, he tried to mimic Mussolini's march on Rome with the Beer Hall Putsch, an armed coup in Munich that was broken up by police gunfire in hours. 16 Nazis were dead, and Hitler was locked in Landsberg prison with a 5-year sentence for high treason. Most thought that was the end of him, but those 9 months in prison were the most critical of his life. For the first time, he had nothing but time to reflect, to analyze his failure, to write his playbook, Mein Kampf. He realized an armed coup would never work in Germany. The German people craved order, not chaos. To kill the Republic, he would use its own democratic rules against it. He would win votes and walk into the Chancellor's office through the front door. To win those votes, he didn't rely on just charisma. He segmented the German population into 3 distinct groups and built a tailored promise for each one exactly what each demographic needed to hear. No exceptions, no compromises. For the starving working class and bankrupt farmers, the promise was brutally simple: bread and work. The Weimar government had talked to them about constitutional rights while their children went hungry. Hitler promised them a job, a full table, and restored dignity. For the terrified middle class, shopkeepers, civil servants, teachers who'd watched their savings burn in hyperinflation, he promised safety and order. He weaponized their fear of communist revolution and street violence, marching his uniformed SA stormtroopers through the streets in perfect lockstep to project unshakable control. For the arrogant elite, the Junker aristocrats, industrial titans like Krupp, and the German High Command, he promised power and profit. In secret backroom deals, he vowed to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, rebuild the army, and hand them defense contracts stretching a decade into the future. He fused far-left populist anger, far-right nationalist fervor, and cold corporate greed into a single unstoppable machine. In 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag. On January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany. He had taken over the company. Now he had to keep it from collapsing. Every promise Hitler had made depended on one thing: tearing up the Treaty of Versailles. But that meant directly challenging Britain and France, the two global superpowers that had written the treaty, that held all the military and diplomatic cards. He didn't flinch because he'd done his homework. He'd diagnosed the fatal flaws paralyzing both nations and knew exactly how to exploit them. First, Britain. The British elite were crippled by three fatal weaknesses Hitler weaponized to perfection. First, guilt. By the 1930s, most of Britain's political and intellectual class believed the Treaty of Versailles had been unfairly draconian, that Germany was right to chafe against its constraints. Second, war weariness. 750,000 British men had died in the trenches of World War I, and the public recoiled at the very whisper of another conflict. Politicians who talked of rearmament were voted out of office. Most critically, the British elite feared one thing far more than Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and the Soviet Union. To them, communism was an existential threat to the British Empire and the global capitalist order. Hitler's masterstroke was positioning himself as their firewall. He whispered to London that a rearmament Germany was the only thing standing between Western Europe and the Bolshevik hordes. "Let me rebuild my military," he said, "and I'll do your dirty work for you." It worked. In 1935, Britain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement behind France's back, explicitly allowing Germany to build a navy 35% the size of the Royal Navy, and to build submarines, something Versailles had banned entirely. In one stroke, Britain had ripped a fatal hole in the treaty it had sworn to enforce. France, meanwhile, was paralyzed by trauma. 1.4 million French soldiers had died in World War I. 10% of its entire male population was gone. Its birth rate had collapsed, and its people were terrified of another war. Instead of preparing to fight, they hid behind the Maginot Line, a 450-kilometer network of concrete bunkers and fortifications along the German border. Their strategy was simple. As long as Germany didn't cross the line, they would look the other way, no matter what Hitler did. Hitler saw their cowardice clearly. He framed every treaty violation as an act of justice, a demand for national self-determination. He knew the French would never fight a war that didn't directly threaten their own border. But before he tested their resolve, he had to lock down his power at home. He had to turn a political party into a religious movement, to make his regime look unbeatable, to hypnotize a nation into believing he was invincible. And he used the one skill he'd honed his entire life, the power of aesthetics. Hitler's failed art career was not a footnote. It was the key to his consolidation of power. He understood a truth few politicians ever grasp. To sell an extreme, hateful ideology, you have to package it to look sacred, beautiful, inevitable. You have to turn violence into poetry, hate into grandeur. He built a visual, sensory brand unlike anything the world had ever seen. It started with the swastika flag. He designed it himself, every element calculated for maximum psychological impact. The crimson-red background was lifted from the socialist left to capture the working class's fervor. The white circle represented nationalism and racial purity. The black swastika at its core symbolized the Aryan struggle for victory. Most critically, the black-white-red color scheme was a direct resurrection of the old German Empire's flag, engineered to trigger a primal, nostalgic pride in a nation that had lost its sense of greatness. Then came the uniforms. The Weimar elite wore stuffy top hats and tailcoats, radiating weakness and obsolescence. Hitler partnered with Germany's finest tailors, including the firm of Hugo Boss, to create the most imposing military garments ever conceived. The infamous black SS uniform with its cinched waist, high stiff collar, silver death's head insignia, and tall leather boots was designed to project absolute authority. For a young, unemployed German man who'd been told he was a loser his whole life, putting on that uniform transformed him. It turned invisibility into fear, inferiority into power, and made violence look elegant, elite, irresistible. Then he turned mass rallies into religious ceremonies. At the annual Nuremberg rallies, his architect Albert Speer created the Cathedral of Light. 152 anti-aircraft searchlights pointed straight into the night sky, forming a colossal luminous temple of light that stretched 8 kilometers into the clouds. Standing before 100,000 chanting followers, Hitler didn't just give a speech, he led a ritual. Foreign diplomats in attendance wrote that they felt their psychological defenses crumbling, that they were watching an unstoppable historical force. His global PR masterstroke was the 1936 Berlin Olympics. He invented the Olympic torch relay, a theatrical stunt that carried the flame from Olympia, Greece, to Berlin, framing Nazi Germany as the rightful heir to ancient Greek civilization. He stripped Berlin of anti-Semitic signs, cleaned the streets to perfection, and ordered every German to project warmth and hospitality to the world. Leni Riefenstahl's groundbreaking documentary, Olympia, glorified Aryan strength and beauty, selling the world a sanitized, majestic lie of Nazi Germany. The brand was complete. Now, Hitler was ready to test the Allies to make the ultimate bluff. Hitler's strategy was simple: small, calculated provocations, constant testing. If the Allies did nothing, he pushed further. If they pushed back, he would retreat. His first 2 tests had gone perfectly. In 1933, he withdrew Germany from the League of Nations. The Allies did nothing but issue angry statements. In 1935, he publicly reinstated conscription and unveiled the Luftwaffe, shattering Versailles' military limits. The Allies did nothing, and Britain handed him the naval agreement months later. Now, he was ready for the suicidal gamble that would make or break his regime: the remilitarization of the Rhineland. The Rhineland was German territory, but Versailles had banned all German troops from the region. It was France's security buffer, the one line in the sand France had sworn to defend. Hitler knew that if France fought back, he was finished. The German force he sent across the Rhine on March 7, 1936, was a paper tiger. 3,000 raw recruits, most on bicycles, in unarmored training vehicles, many without live ammunition in their rifles. Even with reserves, total troop numbers topped out at 30,000. Across the border, France had 100 fully equipped combat divisions, over 1 million men, ready to crush them in hours. Hitler was terrified. Declassified documents later revealed he gave his commanders 2 secret orders: if the French mobilized, if they fired even a single shot, retreat immediately, no fighting, no hesitation. Only if the French did nothing, hold the ground. On that tense morning, the German troops crossed the Rhine, their hearts pounding, waiting for the French army to appear. Hitler waited in Berlin, his fingernails digging into his palms, for the call to retreat. The call never came. France was paralyzed by a chaotic election season and a caretaker government too afraid to mobilize. Its generals warned that fighting would require a full national mobilization, costing billions and enraging a war-weary public. When Paris turned to London for backing, the British dismissed the move, saying, after all, they're just walking into their own backyard. Not a single shot was fired. Hitler had pulled off the greatest bluff in modern military history. Later, he would say, the 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking of my life. If the French had then marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs. For the military resources at our disposal would have been wholly inadequate for even moderate resistance. This was the single greatest missed opportunity to stop Hitler. A single French division would have collapsed his regime, ended his rule, and prevented World War II, but the Allies did nothing. The results were catastrophic. The German generals, once skeptical of Hitler's recklessness, now saw him as a military genius. His power over the army became absolute, and he now knew beyond any doubt that the Allies were paper tigers. They would never fight. The brakes were off now. Hitler needed to test his weapons, to turn his paper army into a real blooded war machine, and the perfect opportunity fell into his lap. In July 1936, the Spanish Civil War erupted. A fascist military coup led by General Francisco Franco had failed, and the country descended into brutal civil war, with Franco's nationalists fighting the Soviet-backed Republican government. Franco sent a desperate telegram to Berlin, begging for military aid. Hitler didn't hesitate. He saw Spain as a free, blood-soaked proving ground, a place to test every new weapon, every new tactic, without triggering a full European war. He deployed the Condor Legion, 12,000 German troops, 600 aircraft, 200 tanks, all dressed in Spanish uniforms, branded as volunteers. These men were not sent to hold trenches. They were sent to gather data, to learn how to fight the next war. For 20 years, European generals had clung to the static, trench-bound warfare of World War I. The Condor Legion redefined war entirely. On the ground, they grouped their panzer tanks into concentrated columns, testing how massed armor could punch through enemy lines and drive deep into the rear, severing supply lines and command centers before the enemy could react. In the air, they tested the Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter, which would become the backbone of the Luftwaffe, and the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. The Stuka was engineered not just to destroy targets, but to terrorize. German engineers bolted a mechanical siren, the Jericho trumpet, to its landing gear. As the plane plunged into a vertical dive, the siren unleashed a deafening, banshee-like shriek that shattered the will of the men on the ground long before the bombs hit. They tested high explosives against concrete buildings. They tested incendiary bombs to see how quickly they could burn a town to the ground. They refined how to coordinate airstrikes with ground advances in real time, a level of integration no other army on Earth could match. The climax of this live fire exercise came on April 26, 1937, over the Basque town of Guernica. Guernica had no military value. No army bases, no weapons factories, no frontline troops. It was a quiet market town of 7,000 civilians. The Condor Legion didn't care. That afternoon, the bombers arrived. First, high explosive bombs collapsed buildings, blocked streets, and shattered the town's water mains. Then, incendiary bombs ignited a firestorm that burned through the wooden and plaster homes, incinerating anyone trapped in the rubble. Finally, fighter planes swept in low, strafing the streets with machine gun fire, gunning down men, women, and children fleeing the flames. In 3 hours, 75% of Guernica was destroyed. Between 200 and 300 civilians were dead, hundreds more maimed. It was one of the first intentional bombings of a civilian population in modern European history, a horror immortalized in Pablo Picasso's masterpiece, Guernica. For Hitler, this was not a war crime, it was terror marketing. He made sure photos of the charred ruins and burned bodies filled the newspapers of London and Paris. The message was unmistakable: this is what awaits your cities if you stand against us. The British public was paralyzed with fear. The very thought of German bombers over London became the single greatest driver of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, giving Hitler whatever he wanted to avoid war at any cost. The Allies did nothing. They condemned the bombing, but refused to intervene. They sat back and watched as Hitler's war machine was blooded, refined, and made deadlier by the day. By 1939, when Franco's nationalists won the war, Hitler's military had learned more about modern warfare in 3 years than most armies learn in a decade of peace. He had also secured his alliances, the Rome-Berlin Axis with Mussolini's Italy, and the anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, framing himself as the global bulwark against communism. Now, he was ready to expand, to take what he wanted without firing a shot. Hitler's first target was his home country, Austria. For years he had used the Austrian Nazi Party to destabilize the country, launching bombings, riots, and a relentless propaganda campaign framing unification with Germany as the only path to prosperity and order. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border. It was not an invasion, it was a parade. Hundreds of thousands of Austrians lined the streets, cheering, throwing flowers, giving the Nazi salute. For millions, unification with a powerful, resurgent Germany was a homecoming, a chance to escape the economic collapse and political chaos that had defined Austria since the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hitler had annexed Austria without firing a single shot. He gained 7 million new citizens, massive iron ore reserves, gold, and military hardware. Germany was now bigger, richer, and more powerful than ever. The Allies did nothing but issue empty condemnations. His next target was Czechoslovakia. On a map, it looked like a small, vulnerable nation sandwiched between Germany and Austria. In reality, it was a military juggernaut. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, Czechoslovakia inherited 70 to 80% of its heavy industry, centered on the Škoda works. In 1938, Škoda alone produced more munitions than the entire British Empire's military factories combined. Along its western border with Germany, in the Sudetenland, the Czechs had built the Little Maginot Line, a near-impenetrable network of concrete bunkers, minefields, and interlocking artillery positions manned by 35 elite, well-equipped divisions. A frontal assault would be a bloodbath and would almost certainly destroy the Škoda factories Hitler coveted. He didn't need to invade. He used the Sudetenland's 3 million ethnic Germans as his excuse. His propaganda machine screamed that the Czech government was torturing and murdering Sudeten Germans, that he was merely fighting for the same national self-determination the Allies had enshrined in the Treaty of Versailles. He was using their own values against them. By the summer of 1938, Hitler was massing 750,000 troops on the Czech border, threatening to invade by October 1 if the Sudetenland was not handed over. Europe was on the brink of war. Neville Chamberlain was determined to avoid conflict at any cost. Over a month, he flew to Germany 3 times to meet with Hitler, each time caving to his escalating demands. Finally, on September 29, 1938, the Munich Conference convened. The leaders of Germany, Britain, France, and Italy sat around the table to carve up Czechoslovakia. The Czechs themselves were locked outside the conference hall, forbidden from speaking, forced to wait while their fate was decided. Hitler pounded the table, threatening total war. Mussolini feigned neutrality, presenting a compromise plan written by Hitler's own Foreign Office the night before. Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier caved completely. At 1 a.m. on September 30th, the Munich Agreement was signed. Britain and France handed the entire Sudetenland. including the Little Maginot Line, 70% of Czechoslovakia's steel and coal reserves, and its most critical defensive positions over to Germany. In exchange, Hitler signed a single sheet of paper promising this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain flew back to London, waved that paper at a cheering crowd, and declared he had secured peace for our time. The British public celebrated, believing war had been averted. They had no idea that Chamberlain's cowardice had just saved Hitler's life. A cabal of senior German generals, convinced an invasion of Czechoslovakia would end in catastrophic defeat, had plotted a coup. They planned to storm the chancellery, arrest Hitler, and end the Nazi regime the second he ordered the invasion. But when Chamberlain handed him the Sudetenland without a fight, the coup was called off. The generals watched in stunned silence as Hitler gained Europe's most formidable arms industry without spilling a drop of German blood. They now believed he was invincible. Hitler never intended to keep his promise. 6 months later, on March 15, 1939, German troops marched into Prague and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was no longer about uniting ethnic Germans. This was naked, unprovoked imperial aggression. The lie of appeasement was shattered. Chamberlain finally woke up to the truth. Hitler would never stop. But it was too late. Hitler now controlled the Škoda works, the Czech army's entire arsenal, and the industrial heart of Central Europe. His war machine was now twice as powerful as it had been a year before. His next target was Poland, but to invade, he had to solve the one problem that had doomed Germany in World War I, a two-front war. He had to neutralize the Soviet Union. Beneath Hitler's string of victories, the German economy was a house of cards, on the brink of total collapse. To fund his rearmament program without raising taxes or alerting the world to his spending, his economics minister, Hjalmar Schacht, had created Mefo bills, secret IOUs issued by a fake shell company used to pay arms manufacturers with a 5-year maturity date. The first Mefo bills had been issued in 1934. They were set to mature in 1939. Germany had no way to pay them back. Its foreign currency reserves were completely exhausted. It had no way to import the oil, rubber, and iron ore it needed to keep its war machine running. The only way to avoid economic collapse, the only way to keep the Ponzi scheme going, was to invade and plunder, to steal resources, gold, and land from neighboring nations. Invading Poland was not a choice, it was a necessity. But if he invaded Poland, he faced war with Britain and France in the west. If the Soviet Union attacked from the east, Germany would be crushed. On paper, an alliance with the Soviet Union was impossible. Hitler had built his entire career on hating communism, on declaring the Soviet Union's Slavic population subhuman, on promising to invade and enslave them. Stalin hated fascism and had spent years warning the world about the Nazi threat. But when the stakes were high enough, ideology was discarded. Stalin had watched the Munich conference and was convinced Britain and France were trying to appease Hitler by encouraging him to invade the Soviet Union. He wanted time to rebuild his army, decimated by his own purges, and a deal with Hitler would give him that time. In August 1939, Hitler's foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flew to Moscow. On August 23, in front of Stalin, he signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. To the world, it was a non-aggression treaty. In secret, it was a butcher's map. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Germany would take Western Poland, the Soviet Union would take Eastern Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The world was stunned. The two most bitter ideological enemies on earth had become allies. Poland's death warrant was signed. Hitler now had everything he needed. The Soviet Union was neutralized. His war machine was tested and ready. His economy was on the brink of collapse, forcing him to act. The Allies were weak, unprepared, and divided. He just needed an excuse, a lie to justify the invasion. Hitler's final, most devastating innovation was a completely new way of waging war. A tactic that would let him conquer Poland in weeks and France in months. A tactic that would redefine modern combat, Blitzkrieg, lightning war. For 20 years, European generals had believed the next war would be a repeat of World War I, static trenches, grinding attrition, tanks used as slow, armored support for infantry. But one German general, Heinz Guderian, disagreed. In his 1937 book Achtung Panzer, he laid out a revolutionary theory. Tanks should not be spread across the front to support infantry. They should be concentrated into massive, unstoppable armored fists. The goal was not to fight the enemy along the entire line. It was to find the weakest point in their defenses, drive the entire armored column through it, and never stop. Ignore flanks, ignore surrounded enemy troops, drive deep into the rear, destroy command centers, supply depots, and communication lines. Cut the enemy's army off from its leadership, its food, its ammunition, and it would surrender without a fight. Most of the German high command thought Guderian was reckless, even mad. But Hitler saw immediately that Blitzkrieg was perfect for Germany. It would let him win wars in weeks before the Allies could mobilize their full strength, before Germany's limited resources ran out. He became Guderian's biggest patron, giving him everything he needed to build his armored divisions. The real secret to Blitzkrieg was not the tanks, it was the radio. In 1939, most German tanks were Panzer I and II models, lightly armored, armed with only machine guns or a tiny 20mm cannon, outclassed by even Polish and French tanks. But every single German tank had a radio receiver, and every command vehicle had a two-way radio. British and French tanks relied on flags, hand signals, and motorcycle messengers to communicate. In the chaos of battle, they became blind, deaf, and isolated. German tank commanders used throat microphones, strapped to their larynx to pick up vocal vibrations over the roar of the engine, to coordinate hundreds of tanks in real time. An entire armored division became a single, hyper-connected hive mind, able to adjust tactics, exploit weaknesses, and redirect forces in the middle of battle. This was paired with unprecedented ground-air coordination. The Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers acted as flying artillery. When tanks ran into a defensive bunker, they couldn't break. An air liaison officer riding with the column would radio the circling Stukas. Within minutes, the bombers would dive and destroy the target with pinpoint accuracy. This level of real-time integration was unheard of. It was science fiction to Allied generals still using horse-mounted messengers. By the end of August 1939, 1.5 million German troops, 2,700 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft were massed on the Polish border. Everything was ready. All Hitler needed was the lie. On the night of August 31, 1939, SS officers carried out the Gleiwitz incident. They took concentration camp prisoners, dressed them in Polish army uniforms, killed them, and dumped their bodies at a German radio station on the Polish border. They seized the station, broadcast a message in Polish declaring war on Germany, and fled. The next morning, Hitler addressed the German people. "Poland has attacked us," he said. "Since 5:45 a.m., we have been returning fire." It was a transparent lie, but it didn't matter. At 4:45 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the first shots of World War II rang out. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, anchored in the Danzig harbor, opened fire on the Polish positions at Westerplatte. Seconds later, Luftwaffe bombers screamed across the border, destroying Polish airfields on the ground, wiping out command centers and bombing cities. Then, the Panzer Division surged forward across the Polish frontier. Blitzkrieg had arrived. The Polish army fought with ferocious, suicidal bravery. Cavalry units charged German tanks with lances and swords. Infantry held out against overwhelming odds. But they had no answer to the speed, the coordination, the overwhelming terror of the German assault. Their air force was destroyed in 48 hours. Their communications were cut, Their armies were surrounded, cut off, and annihilated one by one. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. They had finally stood up, but it was too late. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, claiming the territory promised in the secret pact. The Polish government fled the country. On October 6th, the last Polish troops surrendered. Poland had fallen in 35 days. The German war machine had arrived. Europe was about to burn. History Uncovered. Subscribe to Solid Tales.